Hi guys, so this week we are turning to a rival school of philosophy to the Confucianism that we looked at last week. So this week we are going to be looking at the Mohists. So these are the followers of Master Mo. Most often you will see this person referred to as Mozi, M-O-Z-I, Mozi. That just means Master Mo. You will sometimes see text talking about him by his personal name. His actual name is Modi. I don't think I've actually said this before in other lectures. With Chinese names, the family name goes first. So Di is like a given name. Mo is the family name. So when you stick a title on there like Zi, Master, you get Mozi, Master Mo. We don't have very precise knowledge about Master Mo's life. We know that he lived in approximately the 5th century BCE. I told you before, I'm not going to ask you to memorize dates, but the important thing for our purposes is that this is a little bit later than Kongzi, Confucius, whose traditional dates are 551 to 479 BCE. I should also say this is another case where we don't have surviving writings by Mozi himself. The text that is excerpted and translated in your readings textbook is titled the Mozi, same name for the text as for the person, the philosopher. But as you'll see when you read it, it's not written in his own voice. There's a lot of talking in the third person about, this is why our master Mozi says such and such. Okay, so what's distinctive about Moism? I'm going to highlight in this video 3 important differences from Confucianism. So first of all, Mohist ethical theory, at least, is generalist rather than particularist. It's consequentialist, whereas, at least on the interpretation given in chapter 3 of your textbook, Kongzi's ethics are a radical virtue ethics. And the Mohists defend impartial caring, or inclusive care, as it's sometimes translated, as against the differentiated caring we saw from Confucius. So I will, in this video, talk about each of those things in turn, briefly. So first of all, let's talk about generalism and particularism. So here are the definitions from your intro textbook, the way Van Norden defines extreme generalism and extreme particularism. So he says, extreme generalism is the view that one substantive rule captures all moral evaluations, one law to rule them all. Extreme particularism, on the other hand, is the view that there are no substantive, useful moral rules. All moral evaluation is completely context sensitive. Now, the way Van Norden describes it, and this makes sense to me, it's not that there's like a sharp distinction between generalism and particularism. So this is different from like consequentialism versus virtue ethics, right? They're radical virtue ethics and consequentialism say fundamentally different things. You accept one or you accept the other. In this case, with generalism and particularism, it's probably more helpful to think, as the textbook does, in terms of a spectrum. So there's extreme generalism on the one end, saying there's just one rule and it applies everywhere and captures everything. And on the far other end, we say there are no general useful rules. Everything just depends on context. But there might be sort of in-between views. There are definitely in-between views. So there are some people who are pretty generalist. Here's something that sounds pretty generalist. Imagine you think the 10 Commandments give substantive rules, not just one rule, 10 of them. Maybe you think all you need to do, the only moral facts, or the only moral evaluations that make any sense are evaluations made by checking whether you're following the 10 Commandments. That's pretty generalist. That's not very sensitive to context, but it's not the extreme generalism that says there's just one rule. On the other hand, think of somebody who's pretty particular, somebody who thinks there's lots and lots of variations and maybe we need, sort of nuanced, careful judgment about particular cases, taking in all their details of the context to decide whether what the right action is or something like that. That sounds pretty particularist, but you might want to say in that case that still there might be a fuzzy boundary between particularism and generalism, because even in those very difficult cases where you have to pay attention to the context, you might just think that that means you're applying lots of general rules. It's not that there aren't general substantive rules that determine what's right and what's wrong. It's just that there might be a lot of them that apply in a particular case that has like messy details. Okay. So there's this general sort of spectrum. Maybe it's going to be difficult to say of any particular theorist whether they are a generalist or a particularist. Maybe everybody's a little bit of one, a little bit of both. But there's still a difference in emphasis. And you might also think there are sort of general reasons to prefer one end of the spectrum over the other. And as you'll see, we get arguments like that in the Mozi. So we can at least say this, though. Kongzi looks like a particularist. Mozi looks more generalist instead. So Kongzi, there are bits of the Analects where he says things about how you need to trust the gentleman's judgment in particular cases, trust wise judgment about particular cases, rather than saying, here are the rules you need to live by. Whereas Mozi is going to say that in particular is a bad thing. We want to have general rules. We need, as we'll see him say on, I think, my next slide, a fixed standard. So why would one want to be a generalist? Why would you, generally speaking, prefer maybe a generalist moral theory over a particularist one? Well, one reason is you might very simply just say there needs to be a basis for our moral judgments, right? We don't want to just say, or at least one might be suspicious of a certain kind of Confucian who says, look, trust me, I'm a gentleman. I'm not a petty person. Just go with my judgment. If I think it's okay, it's okay. If I think you're doing something wrong, then you're doing something wrong. Why? Because I said so. Look, I've got an eye for these things. Just trust me. That might seem unsatisfying, especially as like the basis for your moral theory. You might want to say, well, maybe there are, people who are good judges of these sorts of things, and we do want to trust them. But if they're right or wrong, it's not just like we want to have some basis for that. We want to have something that could be made public, something that we can share in. Maybe we want to be able to reason about what's the right thing to do together. And in that case, you're going to want some fixed standard, some general rule that we can all try and apply to a particular case. This is a slightly different point that I'm making in this bullet. I'll just read it. We expect facts about right and wrong to be objective and universal in some sense. So the point I was making a second ago was about our reasoning about what's right and what's wrong. We might want that to be public. So if you want there to be a basis for our moral judgments, we should be able to share in that and work together to get things right or wrong. But you might also want to just say, look, aside from our ability to determine what's right and wrong and our ability to reason together about it, you might expect that there are facts, objective facts about what's right and wrong. And we expect those sorts of things to be, objective and universal. So it's not just about somebody's subjective judgment. So my judgments about how much salt to put in my food is somewhat subjective. My wife likes more salt in her food than I do, generally speaking. I don't think that there's anything more to those judgments than just our own personal preferences. She likes more salt. I like a little bit less salt. She has one judgment about the correct amount of salt. I have another one. There's no objectivity here. All there is to the facts is what's nice for me and what's nice for her. Moral facts shouldn't be like that. If something is wrong, it's wrong for everyone, or it's wrong, period, or from the point of view from nowhere, or something like that. But we also expect, so aside from objectivity, we expect facts about right and wrong to be universal. So if something is wrong for one person to do it's wrong for anyone to do. If there's a reason why it's wrong for you to, I don't know, let's say steal in some case, that should always be a reason not to steal in any other case. Whatever reasons make a difference to whether something's right and wrong in a particular context should still be reasons why that thing is right or wrong in every other context. Maybe the reason why we get something like particularism, remember I said this is just going to be a spectrum, maybe the reason we get something like particularism is just that there are lots of these kinds of reasons that apply in a particular case. But you might expect, we might just, at a very general theoretical level, expect that moral reasons should be universal, should always apply. On the other hand, why not be a generalist? Well, so here's a generic reason I'll give, just in the interest of balance. So this obviously doesn't come from the Mozi because they are arguing for, the Mohists argue for generalism, not against it. Why not be a generalist? Well, maybe just because that's not how things work. You might just worry that, so it would be nice, yes, we would like to have clear, public, objective, universal bases for our moral judgments. But it might just be that the world is such a mess, and there are so many different principles that compete with each other, that overlap with each other, that interfere with each other in particular cases, that it's just going to be at best misleading to hold too closely to any general rule. So like the rule that says, we were thinking of commandments, the rule that says thou shalt not lie. Maybe there's something fundamentally right about that. We can concede this to the generalist and say, look, it is in general worse to lie than not to lie. Lying in itself is a bad kind of thing. But there are so many exceptions to that. There are so many cases where it's fine to lie. Ranging from, lying to the axe murderer at the door, who wants to know if you're sheltering the family that he wants to murder, to something as simple as somebody asking you, how are you doing? And saying, I'm fine, just because you don't want to get into it. And because it would be, that's not what the person's really, maybe that's not a lie. You might think people lie all the time, and that's fine. And writing down a commandment that says you shouldn't lie is probably going to be more misleading than helpful. So you might want to say the sort of thing we should emphasize in trying to help people be better morally, which, by the way, you might think is the point of a moral theory, would be to help them exercise wise judgment, wise context-sensitive judgment, rather than giving them a simple list of rules that they then might stick too closely to. Okay. That's generalism. Let's talk about consequentialism. So my impression from talking to you guys last week, to a sample of you guys last week, is that most of you have run into something like consequentialism before, but let's just get this on the table. So on our textbook's interpretation, Kongzi is a radical virtue ethicist, whereas Mozi is a consequentialist. So the radical word here matters in radical virtue ethics. Roughly, here's how Van Norden defines radical virtue ethics. So first of all, here's the radical part. Questions about what makes a good person or a good life precede questions about good action. Good action is what a good person would do. Moderate virtue ethics might say, look, we're going to give you a theory of what the virtues are, but questions about what makes a good person or a good life come after questions about good action. What's a good person? It's the kind of person who does the right thing. So you can be a consequentialist and a moderate virtue ethicist. But a radical virtue ethics is going to say, if you want to answer those questions about what is morally right or wrong action, first you have to sort out what makes a good life or a good character. Okay, so consequentialism says that questions about right and wrong action precede questions about good character. Here's the consequentialist part. An action's consequences are what matters morally. there might be the important part here is the underlined word, the consequences are what matters. I've said an action's consequences. Some versions of consequentialism will be rule consequential, and so they'll say something like the general consequences of the sort of rule you're acting on are what matters morally, rather than the consequences of the particular action we're evaluating. Or we might say, rather than the actual consequences of an action, what matters are the expected or the reasonably expected consequences. But the important point, the thing that unifies consequentialists, is that we focus on the results of your actions. Those are the things that matter. Okay. Just to be clear, utilitarianism, which I think is the kind of consequentialism you're most likely to have seen before, is just one kind of consequentialism. So Moza, importantly, is a consequentialist, but he's not a utilitarian. Not just because he lived before that was a thing, but because he sees things differently than the utilitarians do. How so? Well, okay. All consequentialists, including Moza and the utilitarians, will agree that an action's consequences are what matters, but they don't all agree about what kinds of consequences matter. So we agree, if you want to check whether something is right or wrong, what you need to look at are its consequences, but they'll differ on the question you're going to ask about those consequences. So utilitarians say, I want to check what amount of pleasure and pain resulted from the action or the rule or whatever. We want the most pleasure for the most people and the least pain for the most people. Lots of pleasure, not much pain. The Mohists, on the other hand, so here's a line from the Stanford Encyclopedia article on Mohism. Instead, their theory is based on a loose notion of human welfare comprising a plurality of basic goods. So the short list you get in your intro textbook is wealth, populousness, and social order as opposed to chaos. So they don't say, we just want to make sure that the most people are the most pleasured, the most happy, and the least in pain. They say, we want to evaluate actions by their good consequences. We at least think that wealth is good and poverty is bad. Increases in population of the state are good, decreases are bad. Social order is good, social chaos is bad. A couple of things to notice here. First of all, at least most easily, most naturally, those three goods seem like the sorts of things that a state would care about, or a governor or a ruler or something like that, as opposed to an individual person. So remember I said in our very first lecture, there's a reason why there's a flourishing of, or there's a social scientific explanation for why there's a flourishing of schools of philosophy in this period, the Eastern Zhou. And that explanation involves a demand for philosophical theories that will tell you how to run your state well, how to outcompete all the other many states who are competing and in conflict. And that creates pressure for people who are in the business of selling their philosophical ideas to address themselves to rulers and say, here's how to run your state well. And that's plausibly what's going on with the Mohists. So when they're thinking about how a ruler should decide what is the right action, well, they're going to care about their state. They're going to care about their state running well. What does it take for a state to run well? Well, if the population is rising, that seems like a good thing. This is well before anyone was concerned about overpopulation. Having more people in your state was definitely a good thing. You've got more people to work the fields. You've got more people to tax, if that's the sort of thing that you're looking at. If people are having children, then they probably have other things that are stable. If the number of adults is increasing, then the children aren't dying. This is at least a good sign that things are going well in this context. Wealth, clearly better than poverty. People are going to be better off if they're wealthier than if they're poorer. Um, I don't think I need to explain why social order is better than social chaos. I think that's just sort of baked into the words. So, okay, we've got that kind of focus. It kind of makes sense in that case if you're thinking about the health of a state and of the people in that state, to be focused not so much on pleasure and pain, but on these more social goods. But right, certainly, I don't think we should take that to mean the Mohists don't have anything to say to ordinary people about how to live their lives. You will see arguments about um, whether their view is incompatible with filial piety. They'll talk about people, good Mohist people, caring for their parents and caring for other people's parents and that kind of thing. That's an ordinary person kind of concern. So here's what's important for us. The Mohists are definitely consequentialist. They are not utilitarians because they care about different kinds of pleasure, or sorry, different kinds of goods. Different kinds of consequences are what matter to them. It's not just pleasure and pain. But here's something they have in common with utilitarians that isn't already baked into consequentialism. So consequentialism says the thing you need to care about is the consequences of an action or a rule or a state policy or whatever. The next question we looked at was what kinds of consequences matter. Another question after that is for whom? You could be a consequentialist who still buys like a Confucian story about differentiated caring. We might say, look, I care about the wealth and populousness and social order of my family, and everybody else can fend for themselves and they don't matter. That is not what the Mohists think. That's not what the utilitarians think. The utilitarians think you need to care about the pleasure and pain of every person equally. The greatest happiness for the greatest number. The Mohists also think, and this is our next theme, just like the utilitarians, everybody matters. And matters equally. So in our textbook, the key phrase is translated as impartial caring. So remember Kong's differentiated caring, my gloss on that was that we do and we should care more for our close social relations. That doesn't have to mean just family. Friends count too. The ruler-subject relation matters, but these social relationships make a difference to how much, as a matter of fact, we do, and also how much we should care for, look out for the people around us. You might have different moral responsibilities to your neighbors than to your parents. If your neighbor breaks a law, maybe you should report them. If your father breaks a law, Confucius seems to think you should cover up for him. Okay. Here's a reason to dislike that. I'm putting words into the Mohist's mouth. That sounds like nepotism. So nepotism is probably best seen as a form of corruption, right? And again, if we're concerned with how you're running a state, we're going to care about how state officials behave. If you have state officials giving special favors to their family, if you have like a ruling class of officials who realize that their children are not going to report them for their crimes, and they happen to know, let's say, that their children are in charge of the police, or not that they have police, but that kind of thing, then maybe those folks are going to run wild. Those parents of important children are going to go and break laws like crazy. That sounds like it's going to lead to social chaos. That sounds no good. So if you're concerned with good social order, as the Mohists are, and as Confucius is, you might want to say, no, we don't want people to be so partial to their families and their friends. We want you to care about everybody equally. We want everyone's welfare to matter. Here's maybe an illustration. I'm a little bit hesitant to put this up because I don't want to be that cartoon of leftist lecturer indoctrinating their students, but I also kind of feel like if I don't put up anything political ever in any of my lectures, I'm letting you guys down. Maybe you were expecting me to. Anyway, so here's a graphic that I saw somewhere on social media. I think I saw it on Facebook and on Twitter. I don't know where this comes from. I think it might come from the Financial Times. Anyway, I have seen this diagram showing like Boris Johnson's inner circle and their relations to each other. I've seen this describing the incestuous relation between all of these folks. Let me just say, I think there are plenty of problems with the current government. I'm not sure that this is one of them. I mean, is this more than like more close relations between a bunch of people working together in a government than you would normally get? I kind of need to see the control group to know how bad this is. But okay, here's a Mohist kind of criticism you might give. Maybe we want to say, look, if maybe there is evidence of nepotism here, right? Maybe people are getting top jobs because they're friends with or they live in the same neighborhood of North London as some other important person, and that's not a good basis for getting stuff or getting favorable treatment. Maybe like somebody who isn't best friends with Boris Johnson wouldn't be able to get away with going off to a castle on holiday during a lockdown. I think that's the thing that happened with one of these people. Okay, if you're a Mohist, you might want to say, this is the sort of picture you want to avoid in your government, among your state officials. And this is the kind of picture that you get from differentiated caring. Yeah, I'm going to leave that there. Let me conclude with this. So, as I phrased it a second ago, there were two parts to the Confucians' differentiated caring, and this is going to lead us into an objection that the Mohists consider and that you might want to think about. So, two parts: we do and we should care more for those close to us. The Mohists disagree, or well, they disagree with part of this. They say we should not care more for those close to us. We should care for everybody. But they acknowledge that this might be difficult. It might be difficult to get yourself to do that. Maybe we do care more for those close to us, but we should change that. We should make it so that we care equally for everybody. So here's an objection to the Mohist defense of impartial caring. We are partial. That's just not how we are. Human nature is incompatible with impartial caring. So the Mohists have a bunch of responses to different versions of this concern. Short version is, generally speaking, they'll say, yeah, we can change that. I mean, maybe people do tend to care more for their close social relations, but we can learn not to do that anymore. What's evidence for this? Well, a short version of the response is, we've learned to do harder things. If we put ourselves to it, if you apply your state to educating its people correctly, they can learn to care for everybody equally. That's a thing that we can do. So look for those arguments when you're reading the Mozi. I'm going to conclude on this note. So we've got an argument here about something like human nature, right? We are partial. Human nature is incompatible with impartial caring. The philosophers we're going to look at next week, some Confucian philosophers a little bit later than the ones we've been looking at so far, Mengzi and Xunzi, they're going to have a debate about the goodness of human nature. So the sort of tinned history version of this is Mengzi thinks human nature is good and Xunzi thinks it's bad. And so they disagree about the role of ethical cultivation. Do we need to sort of counteract and break human nature and turn it into something good? Or is it the sort of thing where we need our ethical cultivation, our education to enhance and celebrate and prevent the corruption of our basically good nature? So that's something we're going to look at next week. This concept of human nature is one that shows up all over the place in classical Chinese philosophy. But I'm going to leave it there. I will talk to you guys soon.